Hello, this is Martin Gore from Depeche Mode.
Hi, this is Dave Gahan from Depeche Mode, and you are listening to
My Nerd World.
And welcome to it. My name is Jon Justice here on Depeche Mode, the podcast. I had an email of somebody who said they missed hearing my son, who was very young at the time, he's 18 now, in the intro for the show. So I decided to bring back the traditional intro once again, even though, as I mentioned last week, I've all but pretty much dropped the My Nerd World moniker. It's still there, branding, right? But I have changed things up. But yeah, you know, it reminds me of just how long I've been doing this podcast, considering that he was, 8 or 9 years old, I think, when he first recorded that, My Nerd World for the intro. But glad you're with another show this week. I got a lot of fantastic emails from you, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com, that we'll be diving into on the show. And in terms of content, I did have one specific question that we'll get into about expectations of what we could get from the band in the future, and I'll be sharing my thoughts on that coming up in the listener feedback portion of the show. But for the main content of the show this week, again, nothing new, and I'll get into that when we get to the emails, but nothing new out of the camp of the band at this point in time as we are well into the second month of this year. I do expect that we are going to be getting some things from the band this year, and I would imagine probably sometime next month. That's my guess. Is that sometime next month we'll hear some news about what we may be getting as fans. And so, again, let me save some of that until we get into the email portion. I do want to start off here, though, because I've changed my tune on something, and I kind of wish that it would stop. So I believe it was last year, towards the end of the Memento Mori tour, where we spent some time on the show, and I even shared some songs that had been created by AI. It was novel at the time. Andrea Fryer had, and still has, probably made what I consider to be some of the best Depeche Mode AI. Be that as it may, it's still artificial intelligence created Depeche Mode. And she created quite a few songs in the way that she was doing it. It's become much easier to do this now, and this is kind of getting to my point, than it was even a year ago. How quickly the AI technology is advancing is truly, truly incredible. And I could actually see bands taking advantage of this technology, which would be interesting as well. If they ended up doing their own music, but ended up tapping into the AI technology to enhance what they already do. That wouldn't surprise me at all, even coming from future music out of the Depeche Mode camp. I don't know exactly what that would look like, but you consider how Depeche Mode has, throughout their multi-decade career, embraced technology, depending on how AI gets utilized in terms of music production. I could certainly see the band, tapping into that. But again, I don't know exactly how you could do that. Apart from making your own songs and using AI to enhance them, or perhaps taking your own work and making it sound like earlier work. I'm just kind of spitballing here. All of this is to say, when it comes to the current crop of Depeche Mode AI that I've been hearing, knock it off already. Now, this is subjective, okay? I get the novelty of AI, and I get the interest of hearing Depeche Mode AI, because I think a lot of times, and I know this rings true for me, going back to when we talked about it and how I was embracing it, as the Memento Mori era was winding down, and what had been created at the time was really interesting. And I still have a few of those AI tracks, but I couldn't tell you the last time that I went and listened to them. Now, however, it just seems like there is Depeche Mode AI all over the place, and it's not good. It's not good at all. I'm a member of a lot of different Depeche Mode groups on Facebook, and I don't spend a ton of time on Facebook anymore. But a lot of people have been posting their Depeche Mode AI creations, and they're just monstrosities. And not only are they not, good, but they they get really bizarre. Like, people are taking Depeche Mode as a baseline to create the song, but then they're saying, but make it in the style of New Order. And it just creates this bizarro Frankenstein remix of something that Depeche Mode never created in the first place. To make matters worse, and again, I say all of this somewhat in jest. I just blow past it right now. People can go and make whatever they want to make. You know, the forums and the fan pages that I belong to on Facebook, a lot of them have rules, and thankfully a lot of them remove this kind of stuff. But not only have I seen and listened to like bad Depeche Mode AI, but there's also now video attached to it. AI created images. I saw one the other day, and it was posted like in multiple places, where they had created like a Dave Gahan vampire, and then these little girls come up next, and it was creepy, it was weird. It's not Depeche Mode, it's fake. I fully embrace AI and what it can do, but personally, I've turned a corner relating to anything Depeche Mode related AI, and I'm kind of over it, and I'm personally kind of tired of seeing it, and it makes me appreciate my beloved, original, genuine, and authentic Depeche Mode even more. I know this runs really contrary to the way that I had talked about it previously, on the episodes last year. But now, with just how much of it's out there, I'm enough of the Depeche Mode AI already. It's not our beloved band. We don't need to do this. If you want to, that's cool. But the novelty for me has absolutely worn off. So here's a question for you this week, and I grabbed this from the Depeche Mode Reddit page for the show. I'll share it here. Drop a comment up on YouTube if you're enjoying the show on YouTube, or email me, talkshownerd@gmail.com. But a fan post was this, asked this question: was there an album that made you tune Depeche Mode out for a while? If you've been a member of this subreddit for years, then you know that there are certain albums that are polarizing and divide the fan base. And it doesn't matter if you're a member of the sub on Reddit. I think we can all agree, even apart from that, there are certain albums that are polarizing and divide the fan base. I, for one, have always been surprised that Songs of Faith and Devotion was an album that apparently was divisive among the fans. And I didn't really find that out until I got well into doing this show and hearing from a lot of you emailing me at talkshownerd@gmail.com. The post goes on to say, for me, the first significant DM album that tuned out some fans was Songs of Faith and Devotion. Sure, they had their earlier albums, Speak and Spell, Some Great Reward, Construction Time Again, that made some fans cringe, but they were young and still finding their voice and sound. When Songs of Faith and Devotion came out, quite a bit of the fans were put off by it. They were probably expecting Violator Part 2, and I've never heard any complaints about the lyrics on Songs of Faith and Devotion, but the change in their sound, the guitar and their drums, proved a bit too much for some long-time Depeche Mode devotees. I've read comments saying the Songs of Faith and Devotion put them off of the band. Not completely, but they felt that they would not give the album the time of day and go back to their older stuff, or came back to DM later on. So, like the title says by the post on Reddit, has there been a DM album that made you take a break from the band? If so, which one was it and why? Now, listen, this is a very, very easy answer for me. No, there was no album that ever made me take a break from the band. And I'm going to venture a guess, apart from those handful of people that have told their stories here on the show about how they did take a break from the band for a while, but only to come back during the Memento Mori phase or other phases during the band. But there was never an album for me personally that turned me off from the band. I mean, there were certainly albums that I listened to less frequently than other albums. Delta Machine being one, Spirit certainly being one as well. But there are always a handful of tracks that sort of end up on my core playlist from every single Depeche Mode album. I can't think of a single Depeche Mode album or a single playlist of Depeche Mode songs that I've put together where there wasn't some, a song or a few songs typically from every album that I go back and listen to on a regular basis. Now, the difference is that often those are the only songs from those albums that I'll ever go back and listen to, apart from when I decide to do a top to bottom listen of a particular album. And that did increase for me as the years went on. And it actually follows a trajectory. And it's not to say the quality of the albums got any worse, but when you have a catalog like Depeche Mode, it was more of an example of quantity than it was quality. I typically lean on newer stuff, and this rings true for any bit of my fandom. I like forward momentum. Enjoying Star Wars movies, I like the newer movies. I'll go back and watch the older ones, but when I go to watch my Star Wars frequently, it's typically newer content. Not all the newer content, by the way, but a lot of the newer content. And the same thing rings true for Depeche Mode. Now, that being said, when you go back to their earlier albums, Songs of Faith and Devotion and pre-Faith and Devotion, music, Black Celebration, Music for the Masses, Violator, Songs of Faith and Devotion. I mean, those are the albums where I will, throughout the course of a year, consume all the tracks on those albums in a fairly consistent manner of listening to them. Whereas you go further into the catalog, and typically it's just pulling a handful of songs from the album. Oddly enough, as I was prepping for the show this week, I was thinking about this question. I was thinking, well, what album do I probably listen to the least amount of songs from? And I was a bit surprised that it was actually Exciter, which is an album that I enjoy quite a bit. And I actually, when I ranked the albums, I think I placed it higher than a lot of the more recent albums. But for some reason, I don't go and revisit a lot of tracks off that record. I think it speaks to how Exciter is kind of unique in and of itself. I think it's a kindred spirit to it's sort of a kindred spirit to Violator, but it's a grand departure from, certainly from Ultra and Songs of Faith and Devotion. And then when you move forward to Sounds of the Universe, it doesn't really sound like it either. So it's interesting when I started to go down that road, because that was an album. If you had asked me like up front, I wouldn't have said that. But when I started looking at my playlist, I go, wow, there are very few tracks that I listen to off of Exciter. And the ones that I do are ones that people never talk about. I mean, I Am You, I love that song. And both of Martin's tracks on that album, Comatose and Breathe, I enjoy quite a bit. So I'd love to get your thoughts on this. As always, TalkShowNerd at gmail.com. Speaking of emails, let's get to your listener feedback this week. First, we hear from friend of the show, Chris Culpepper, who writes this. One of your interview questions for the band was performing a past tour today, which is certainly intriguing, writes Chris. Although I've seen bands performing one of their classic albums or previous tours in their entirety live, it shows me that they are washed up and desperate for ticket sales. Interesting. For example, U2 playing the Joshua Tree album in 2017, 30 years later, to fill seats. One of the reasons why I respect DM is that they pride themselves on staying in the now, not being nostalgic or a greatest hits band. Violator 35th Anniversary Tour 2025 would fill seats, but it would indicate the DM has to rely on their past and is no longer a current credible band capable of producing popular new music. I don't want our beloved DM to become Duran Duran or Journey. Oh, Chris, good friend of the show who we'll talk about a little bit later on. Matt is going to take issue with your dig on Duran Duran. I can see his face and his frantic typing right now. Thank you, though, for the comments there, Chris. I don't necessarily disagree. Let me rephrase. I'm sorry. I don't necessarily agree. I certainly understand why you would have that point of view. I wouldn't personally view it that way. I think given the full context of how old the band is and how the core of their audience are people like you and me, even though there are younger there are younger listeners to Depeche Mode, certainly. Violator 35th Anniversary Tour, I would not look at as their desire to rely on their past or anything like that. I would see it more as a celebration of what most consider to be their greatest achievement. And I would love to hear, even slightly different versions of some of the tracks that we don't typically get live. But, Chris, as always, I appreciate your email. Next up, we have Yvonne Smart, who actually is an author, wrote a book about Depeche Mode called Words of the Universe. This is available. Words of the Universe is available on Amazon. But she goes on to say, I wanted to ask you if you know about the 4 unreleased tracks. Life 2.0 is one of them, and the others. I am from Buenos Aires, Argentina. I listen to your podcast every week. Also, there's a rumor of a DM song to be featured in Stranger Things 5. Have you heard anything about it? Thanks, Yvonne Smart. And again, her book is called Words of the Universe, about Depeche Mode, and it's available up on Amazon. All right, so let me start with the second question first. I did a little digging on that, and I could not personally find any information regarding a Depeche Mode song being featured on Stranger Things Season 5. I did find quite a bit of commentary relating to the use of Never Let Me Down Again from the Last of Us series. And, Kate Bush, Running Up That Hill being used in Stranger Things 5. Journey, of course, was too. I never saw anything relating to specifically a Depeche Mode song being used in the 5th season of Stranger Things. About the 4 unreleased tracks, we will hear those tracks. I'm just going to say that. We will definitely hear those tracks. My expectation is that sometime this year. What it's attached to, as I've mentioned on previous episodes, I don't know yet. When I'm able to tell you or say anything, when I find out specifically, I'll certainly tell you. But those 4 unreleased tracks will be heard by you and me, and I would expect sometime this year. Now, whether they're attached to the Mexico documentary, whether they're attached to a separate physical release of Memento Mori, or the box set, which I think is probably most likely. But as I've speculated on the show before, well, first off, we know for sure Martin brought those songs up, and Martin mentioned Life 2.0. And he had an expectation that those songs were going to get released, and they were held back for reasons. That is to say that those songs will eventually get released. It's just a question of time. It's just a question on what they get released on. And I don't want to get too excited about that, but again, I've mentioned before, I have an expectation that those are pretty solid tracks. There could be any number of reasons why they didn't make the cut, but I've made examples before about other B-sides in the past that were strong. I mean, you look at those B-sides from Violator, Dangerous, Sea of Sin, Happiest Girl, those are great songs. My Joy from Songs of Faith and Devotion, I mean, those are fantastic songs. And I know there are many of you who feel that the tracks that didn't get released on Delta Machine were superior to to some of the tracks we actually got on Delta Machine. One of the other questions I would ask the band is, are there any tracks that didn't make it on Spirit that are sitting out there somewhere that we haven't heard of? I don't know why, but I have like a sneaking suspicion that there's some tracks for Spirit that are out there somewhere that never got released for whatever reason that are pretty good. And I say that because Spirit seemed like such a very deliberate album in terms of its theming and the direction that they wanted to go. The band typically records a lot of songs. I mean, that was certainly the case as well. When you talk about songs didn't make it on the album, for Sounds of the Universe, I mean, there's some great tracks from that album as well. Ghost is a fantastic song. But I wonder if there are tracks from the Spirit sessions that didn't potentially align with the theming of Spirit that they set off to the side. Couldn't use because they would obviously sound much different relating to what we got with Memento Mori, which I still listen to consistently. That album is so great. But I suspect that if there are any B-sides that we didn't get to hear for Spirit, they're probably dramatically different than what we got on the album and might actually be really good. So I know I was cagey with that, but I have to be. So, Yvonne, I hope that helped to answer your question just a little bit. Glenn, 1965, writes, regarding the videos from Memento Mori, I really liked People Are People. That's a good one. It's really thought-provoking, and using a horse in the film mirrors the almost galloping backtrack to the song. Like classic Depeche Mode, it has layers of clever ambiguity and insightfulness. Really enjoyed it right from the listening. Yes, you know what? And I'm, shame on me for not mentioning that in my commentary of the album, of the videos from Memento Mori. I would love to see them in some sort of compilation form. I really do think that if you put all those together in a Strange 3, Strange 2, see what I did there? It could be a nice little package. I prefer the Anton Corbijn directed videos, but all of those videos do feel very similar to themselves. So thank you for that. All right. So last week there was a very controversial email. First off, my apologies. I pronounced his name wrong. So I pronounced it, I believe, Xavier. I think that's what I said. Hold on. I'm sorry. I pronounced it Javier, but his name is actually Xavier. Okay, so my apologies. Xavier wrote last week saying that it was time for Depeche Mode to go and hang it up, and many of you responded with that. So he's back again. He writes this. I enjoy the banner and debate, and please don't get me wrong. DM were, parentheses, the best band in the universe from 86 to 98, and I adored this podcast. Oh, thank you, Xavier. I disagree with you, but I appreciate you sucking up. I'm not going to just unconditionally support DM when new releases and live shows no longer meet my approval. I appreciate the inclusion of my approval. Yes, they rely on the back catalog, writes Xavier. Most nights featured 5 Memento Mori tracks live, and primarily the set was centered around 86 to 93. Sales and popularity have significantly declined since Songs of Faith and Devotion. Can anyone honestly state that such clunkers as Spirit and Exciter even compare to Black Celebration? Well, let's say this. There are certainly people that would do that, right? Because all of this is incredibly subjective. Even on this show, I've focused on that era where I think that they were at their apex and their peak. But when I say that, though, I mean that more in terms of consistency. I think as you get further into the catalog, you still have really high highs, but you have much lower lows. Dave has become a boring vampire crooner, and the last comprehensive record that I remotely liked was Delta Machine. I actually preferred the demos. Okay, again, subjective. I'll argue for the sake of the listener. Completely disagree with Dave becoming a boring vampire crooner. I thought that he was on his game in his stage presence and his vocals, much more so during and on the Memento Mori tour than he was on the Spirit tour. This seemed like, for getting almost, some 7 years older than he was during the Spirit tour, I mean, close to 10 years older, I thought that Dave was the best that he had been. Even like Delta Machine. I'll take Dave Memento Mori tour Dave than I will over Global Spirit tour Dave or Delta Machine tour Dave. And we didn't even, Xavier goes on to say, and we didn't even touch on that Martin Gore relied on Psych Fur's legend Richard Butler for writing assistance of Memento Mori. Enjoy the memories, Black Swarm. That's another question that I would go and I would like to ask Martin Gore. I didn't look at this as Martin Gore relying on Psychedelic Furs. From what I understood, they had talked about doing this for a long time and just decided to go and do it. You're this far into your career with this many albums. Why not try something new? I don't recall that the inclusion of Richard Butler in writing songs with Martin was because Martin was suffering from writer's block. We know that Martin was suffering from writer's block during Exciter, which tells me that if he was having another issue, they would be very open about it, as they were open back when they were recording Exciter. I just thought that this was more of a, let's see how this works out. And it worked out fantastically, in my opinion. I mean, this is a circumstance where I personally wouldn't mind like a Richard Butler coming into the mix with the band, sort of taking on an Alan Wilder role in crafting some of the music, because I really enjoyed those tracks, and I thought they were strong on Memento Mori. Now, Xavier writes, wraps up with this, love you, JJ, and yes, Hold to Feed stinks. Well, you know what there, Xavier, we can agree on that. All right, Fixer UK. And you know what? I had such an epic fail last week talking about religion. And He Gets Us inclusion of the Johnny Cash cover of Personal Jesus that I completely missed like the biggest inclusion of religion in Depeche Mode's back catalog. Fixer UK writes this, let's start from where they first really touched upon religion, Blasphemous Rumors. It's the one that had a big influence on my thoughts on religion. Yeah, it's a good call. It's a good call. And I think I've probably mentioned this before. I always struggled with that song. You know, growing up as a Christian in a staunch Christian household, I had a rough time with, you know, God's got a sick sense of humor and he's laughing. I don't agree with the theming. That being said, it didn't temper my enjoyment of that song. It didn't stop me from singing along with that song. I still love that song. I think it's one of the greatest Depeche Mode songs ever, even if I don't necessarily agree with the lyrical content of the song. I didn't write it. I'm just enjoying it. And last, we'll hear from my good friend Matt, who writes this, talking about the licensing issue of using Johnny Cash's song during the He Gets Us Super Bowl ad. He writes, music licensing is really fascinating to me. Multiple layers of rights had to be obtained, and there's no question that Martin, via his publishing company, had to sign off on it unless, one, he sold his publishing rights to that song, or two, that organization did not properly license the publishing and sync rights to Martin's composition. I suspect we would have heard about the latter, writes Matt. A cease and desist letter made public, if nothing else, and no way does someone fail to properly license music for a Super Bowl commercial. Way too much money involved. He goes on to say, frankly, I was shocked when the commercial came on. I don't think DM controls rights to their master recordings, but certainly Martin controls rights to his publishing. Both sets of rights have to be obtained, and it's rare that we see DM music out in the wild. I can count on one or two hands the number of times it's happened. So to see it in an ad like that, really surprising, as my sense is that Martin jealously guards the exploitation of his publishing rights and DM. While very spiritual, they tend to be apolitical and borderline agnostic, at least when it comes to the use of their music. That said, I would have been just as shocked to see a DM song in a car commercial. Martin just doesn't seem the type to allow his compositions exploited in that way. Yeah, I think the only one that we've really kind of seen is like Just Can't Get Enough. I think that's been used in ads before. I remember the use of, I remember the use of Just Can't Get Enough in an investment ad. Am I remembering that correctly? Yeah, I believe you are. But that would have been Vince, not Martin, allowing the use of that composition. And the record liable allowing use of the master recording. Everything else I can think of is use in films, TV, no commercials per se, but very different. I always appreciate the insight, Matt, and I know we're going to get him on the show sometime in the very near future to sort of discuss this a little bit further based off of his background when it comes to licensing rights. And listen, that wraps up the show for this week. It's going to be an exciting year, I think, for Depeche Mode. I don't expect that we're going to get new music. But we fans will be pleased. I'll just say that. Thank you so much for checking out another episode. As always, if you want to support my nerd world and you like science fiction, I do host a science fiction Star Wars podcast. Just search for Star Wars and Jon Justice on whatever podcast feed you're listening to this on. Or if you're on YouTube, you can find it right next to this video as well. I've also written a science fiction space opera series. I wrote it out of my love of Star Wars, but also Depeche Mode. Set in the future where air and space flight culture has replaced car culture. It was inspired in part by Depeche Mode. And I also made the music of the 80s through the 2000s Nostalgic and popular among the characters in the story, even though it's set in 2172. Very much inspired by Ready Player One, which I was reading and then subsequently waiting for the movie at the time when I wrote book 1 in my 7-book series. As Earth faces its end, you'll follow pilots Taft and Katha, along with their crew on a journey of survival across the galaxy as they fight for humanity's future. It is a fast-paced and action-packed science fiction adventure available right now on Amazon.com. Written for adults, but age-appropriate for those 11 up. Pick up EMBARK Book 1 today and support the podcast. Amazon.com, search for EMBARK and Jon Justice. You can find the description of all 7 books in the series available in hardcover, paperback, ebook, Kindle Unlimited, and audiobook. Amazon.com. EMBARK, Jon Justice. Thank you so much for checking out this week's episode. I'll be back again next week. I hope to hear from you. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com. And wherever you are, I hope you're happy, you're healthy, you're safe. God bless. And I'll talk to you again next week. Bye.
Hello, this is Martin Gore from Depeche Mode.
Hi, this is Gahan from Depeche Mode, and you are listening to
Depeche Mode, the podcast.